Despite the success of the first live-action TMNT movie, producers caved to parent groups, toning down the violence and leaning too much into humor. But when that approach narrowed the audience, they were finally ready to listen to the Turtles' creators again. But would a third movie get them back on track? Or would this be the last live-action adventure for our heroes in a half-shell? Join me as I explore Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, a movie that was certainly not titled Turtles in Time. For TMNT creators Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, the second movie was a step backward from what they wanted the Turtles to be on the big screen. Producers had given in to parent groups, second-guessing what made the first film a groundbreaking success. Since the creators still had story approval rights, they made sure pre-production started off right. Under their watch, the next movie would focus on a solid story aimed at audiences of all ages. Fortunately, they had an ally in writer-director Stuart Gillard, who also wanted a grittier tone. He thought parents' complaints about violence were ridiculous. After all, these were 4 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fighting in a movie. How serious could that violence really be? The writer traveled to Massachusetts 3 times, pitching different ideas, hoping to convince the creators to sign off on a treatment. According to Stu, Eastman and Laird would open envelopes while listening, casually leaving their residual checks on the table, a not-so-subtle way of saying they didn't need another movie. Perhaps a negotiation tactic to pressure the producers to listen to them this time. None of Stewart's pitches convinced them, until, in casual conversation, they started talking about time travel movies. They quickly realized they all loved sending the Turtles back to feudal Japan, landing them in the middle of an epic battle. That image was enough for Eastman and Laird to approve the concept, skipping the entire treatment phase. Part of the creator's conditions on Stewart was not to use the Foot Clan or the Shredder. This would serve the purpose of breaking up with the previous movie and starting fresh. Finally, all 3 agreed to bring Casey Jones back. Writing the screenplay was a fascinating challenge for Stewart. He only had one clear image: the Turtles being thrown into a massive samurai battle. But how would they get there? Who were the warring factions? There was a lot to figure out. He reverse-engineered the entire movie from that one scene, ultimately landing on a loose adaptation of the Magnificent Seven. The Turtles needed a device to travel through time, but contrary to popular belief, Stewart didn't base it on the sacred sands of time, the scepter used by Renette and the Time Lords in the Mirage comics. Despite the similarities, he wasn't familiar with the character or the artifact, or at least he doesn't recall being aware of them. Because this was a time displacement story, he also had 4 samurai swap places with the Turtles, serving as the comedic relief while the main drama unfolded in the past. The Golden Scepter was later nicknamed the Time Slippin' Scepter for the action figures. Producer Tom Gray admitted they had gone too far into cartoon territory with the second movie. The first film appealed to kids and teenagers, but the sequel lost the older crowd. By 1993, the preteens who loved the sequel were a little older, so it made sense to age the tone. Thinking preteens were guaranteed to show up, they needed a real story, not just action and jokes, to win back teenagers. The nature of the plot meant they had to be careful with cultural representation, ensuring the film wouldn't offend Japanese audiences. Special attention went into production design and character development. It was also an interesting balancing exercise for them. They wanted to return to the first movie's action levels without showing blood or gratuitous violence. Right up until release, it was unclear if the movie would have a subtitle. It started being The Sacred Scroll of Death, and later it was A Feudal Fable. One particular title was The Turtles Are Back, in Time, which was likely just a marketing line, though the book adaptation used it as the full title. And yes, the movie would eventually be known by another name, but more on that later. Aside from the main characters and villains, the story also centered around a prince and a princess. Vivian Wu played Princess Mitsu, a character the producers hoped would broaden the target audience by appealing to young girls. Her counterpart, Prince Henshin, was played by Henry Hayashi, later known as Aiden Hanze. Interestingly, his mother's lineage included samurai warriors and athletes, while his father's side came from monks and philosophers. So, in a way, playing a samurai was in his blood. Golden Harvest knew the third movie wouldn't be a bigger hit than the second, so they adjusted the budget accordingly. There are conflicting accounts about why they switched creature shops, but the most believable reason was simple: cost cutting. Hiring a company in the United States was cheaper than shipping everything from London, where Jim Henson's creature shop was based. Producer Terry Morse had allegedly grown frustrated with technical issues from Henson's animatronics system, which was known to have radio frequency interference problems and unexpected breakdowns. This led him to invite All Effects to bid for the job against Henson. All Effects was a Hollywood-based robotics company that had worked on famous projects like Number 5 from Short Circuit and the Energizer Bunny. Of course, Henson's shop owned their technology, meaning All Effects had to develop their own performance system from scratch in just 4 months. Not only did they pull it off, but their system, running on Windows 3, worked without any of the radio interference issues that had plagued Henson's setup. Each animatronic turtle head contained 15 servo gears, controlling different parts of the face. The puppeteers could operate movements individually or sync them up using a computer system, allowing for faster replication of complex expressions. According to Eric Allard, the All Effects creature supervisor, Henson was banking on them failing. And when they succeeded, the Henson team allegedly accused them of industrial espionage. If you want to hear All Effects' side of the story, check on their interview with Brian Van Hooker on the Turtle Tracks podcast. With Henson's creature shop out, some previous suit performers, like Michelin Sisti, Leif Tilden, and Kevin Clash, moved on to other projects. Splinter was still a puppet, but this time he had robotic arms, allowing for remote control of his wrists, fingers, and movements. Since Henson owned the previous designs, All Effects had to create new ones from scratch. A challenging task, given that all they had for reference were production photos and footage from the movies. Knowing the new suits wouldn't look exactly the same, Eric Allard and Rick Stratton suggested aging up the turtles, making them slightly older and more muscular. The producers shot that idea down. After all, the title demanded they stay teenagers forever. While the final designs looked acceptable to the All Effects team, the producers had notes. Notes that fans would later have too. Like the colors being too vibrant. They asked them to make them more olive-colored like the Henson suits. All Effects ignored this, assuming the original suits only looked darker because they'd gotten dirty. With what they considered was a close enough design, the rest of the attention went into producing the suits. These weighed around 50 pounds each, and it took 60 people and $2.8 million to build them. Performing inside one of these was no fun. The actors were put through brutal training, including long sessions in saunas, almost against their will, to build heat tolerance for the extreme temperatures inside the suits. Because of how much stress the suits endured, they needed multiple backups. According to Rick Stratton, the actors went through at least 2 suits per day, as actors wanted to have showers after a few hours. As usual, there were variations of the suits for stuntmen and horse riders. Filming took place during the summer of 1992 in Astoria, Oregon, which doubled as feudal Japan. To create an authentic-looking village, the producers imported 2 loads of Chinese bamboo, and the crew spent 12 weeks building the set on a 4-acre, logged-off section of the Coast Range Mountains. The production also took advantage of an abandoned World War II military base, constructing sets inside its airplane hangars. The subway den was transported from North Carolina to one of these hangars. Even the castle was built inside the hangar, which helped them avoid Oregon's unpredictable rain. As with the previous films, any audio from scenes involving animatronics couldn't be used. This meant the entire movie had to be dubbed in post-production by the voice actors. But unlike before, There was a lot of improvisation, mostly because they had no choice. According to Robbie Rist, the animatronics sometimes didn't match the original dialogue, forcing the actors to make up new lines on the spot. The score was once again composed by John Duprez, but the soundtrack is worth a separate mention. With all the cost cutting, the producers put together one of the most random Turtle movie soundtracks ever, featuring an 8-year-old song, a reused track from the first soundtrack, and other similar enough songs to other popular tracks. One of the most bizarre choices was Tarzan Boy, a song from 1985. Yet, thanks to the movie, it climbed back onto the Billboard Hot 100, staying there until June 1993. The soundtrack even included a remix by Daniel Abraham. The movie started in Japan in 1603. Prince Kenshin was being chased down by his father's honor guard, who forced him to return to Norinaga Castle to face his father, Lord Norinaga. Ashamed of his father's war, Kenshin had joined the rebellion led by his lover, Mitsu. But Norinaga, frustrated with his son's defiance, was ready to deal with him harshly until the sudden arrival of Dirk Walker, a ruthless English trader. Walker demonstrated the power of his firearms, proving himself a valuable ally. If Norinaga wanted to crush the rebellion, Walker's guns and cannons might be the key. Furious at his father, Kenshin lashed out, smashing a statue, and in doing so, accidentally uncovered a mysterious scepter. The moment it was revealed, supernatural forces awakened, triggering the unveiling of an ancient scroll. It depicted a battle against 4 Kappa, legendary creatures that bore an uncanny resemblance to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Kenshin noticed the scepter blinking. He read the words engraved on its handle, unknowingly activating it, causing him to switch places with April O'Neil in 1993. Now dressed in Kenshin's clothes, April appeared in feudal Japan, completely confused. She had bought the scepter as a gift for Master Splinter, assuming it was just a decorative antique. Meanwhile, in the present, Kenshin appeared inside the turtle's lair, terrified to find himself surrounded by 4 mutant ninja turtles and a giant rat. It didn't take long for the turtles to figure out what had happened. Kenshin had come from feudal Japan, and if they wanted to bring April back, they had no choice but to go after her. In the past, the daimyo's men believed April was a witch who had made his son disappear. Seeing an opportunity, April played along, but Walker, ever the skeptic, saw through her bluff. She was thrown into the dungeon, where she met Wit, one of Walker's men who had once tried to lead a mutiny against him. Coincidentally, Wit looked just like Casey Jones. In the present, Donatello worked out the rules of the time displacement device. It could only activate if the travelers matched in weight every 12 hours. They had only 60 hours, just 2 days, to go to the past and return. Since the Turtles needed people from the past to swap places, they called in Casey Jones to help keep Splinter and the Scepter safe while sorting things out. Kenshin revealed a crucial detail. Mitsu's village was in danger. He had to return to protect her from Norinaga's army. The Turtles activated the Scepter, swapping places with 4 of Norinaga's honor guards. The moment the guards appeared in the present, Master Splinter realized the Turtles had been sent straight into battle. And sure enough, the Turtles materialized on horseback, right in the middle of combat. Unfortunately, none of them knew how to ride, so they immediately fell into the mud. Mikey had it worse. He appeared facing backward, got knocked off his horse by a tree branch, and was taken by the rebellion. Back at the castle, Norinaga realized his honor guards were missing. This worried him, not because of their lives, but because they had been carrying the Golden Scepter, a key advantage in the war. Walker listened to Norinaga's worries and asked his henchman, Niles, to bring April to him. That plan failed quickly. Leo, Donnie, and Raph intercepted the mission, rescued April and Wit, and escaped from the castle. The Turtles ran into Mitsu and the rebels. After getting a good look at them, Mitsu realized they were with Mikey and offered to take them to him. Unfortunately, when they reached the village, Walker and Norinaga's men were attacking it, searching for Kenshin and the Scepter. Even with Walker's guns, the Turtles and the rebels managed to scare them off. But the real hero of the battle was Michelangelo. He bravely rescued Mitsu's younger brother, Yoshi, from a fire. After some CPR from Leo, Yoshi came back to life, proving to the villagers that these demons were there to protect them. After their defeat, Nobunaga demanded answers from Walker about the nature of these demons protecting his enemies. He had heard stories from his men, and it seemed like these were the same four kappa that had defeated his ancestor, the ones from the scroll. Feeling the fear in Norunaga's voice, the skeptic Walker offered his guns and cannons against the demons in exchange for gold. This was a steep price increase from his usual silk, silver, and rice payments, but Nobunaga knew the threat was too great. He ordered Walker to proceed with the attack, taking no prisoners. Back at the village, the turtles made a frustrating discovery. The scepter was gone. Someone must have stolen it after Mikey's fall, and since Norunaga's men were also looking for it, that meant it wasn't in the castle either. With time running out, they convinced the local blacksmith to forge a new one. Spoiler alert, once it was finished, it fell and broke. Not that it would have worked anyway. The original scepter had supernatural forces within. Raphael, who before this adventure was wondering what the meaning of all their training was, ran into a peculiar situation in the village. He found the little kids playing hard at fighting in the war against the daimyo, so he stopped Yoshi to tell him he was too young for this kind of activity. He should be doing kid stuff, like flying kites. If Raph couldn't escape this cycle of violence, at the very least, he could protect Yoshi from it. Things were really tense that night. Rumors spread that Norunaga's army would attack at dawn, and the turtles were no closer to returning to the present. Then, just as hope faded, Yoshi revealed a shocking secret. His grandfather had taken the golden scepter, believing that if the turtles stayed, they would help defeat Nobunaga. Unfortunately, Wit revealed himself as a traitor. He stole the scepter, captured Mitsu, and fled to the castle. His message to the turtles was clear. If they wanted her back, they had to bring Kenshin to the daimyo. Doubt crept into Lord Norunaga's mind as he faced Mitsu, now his prisoner. She told him that Kenshin was on a magic journey and that only the scepter could bring him back. She also revealed that the scepter was in Walker's possession. Walker denied everything, and she was sent to the dungeon. April and the turtles snuck back into the castle, determined to rescue Mitsu and open the gates for the rebellion. While battling the guards, they stumbled upon the sacred scroll. Mitsu recognized the epic scene as the Battle of the Thousand Swords, when 4 demons defeated the daimyo and his army. The turtles used this to their advantage, warning Nobunaga that they would leave peacefully if he returned the scepter. But now just as skeptical as Walker, Nobunaga refused to surrender. His stubbornness didn't pay off. After a fight with Leo, he ended up trapped inside a giant bell. But the turtles' advantage was short-lived. Walker had captured April, using her as leverage to force their surrender. Realizing Walker was about to kill her, Wit turned against him, rejecting their freshly formed partnership. Walker simply threw him with the turtles and April to execute them. But knowing the superstitious nature of his enemies, Leonardo bluffed his way out of execution by telling them that demons couldn't be killed. Walker, however, was a skeptic and figured out that turtles couldn't survive a cannonball. It turned out that turtles could hide their heads inside their shells. This way, Leo survived the attack unscathed and removed any traces of skepticism in Walker. Realizing the battle was lost, Walker tried to escape. He threw the scepter away in a last-ditch effort, hoping to distract the turtles. But before he could flee, Wit fired a catapult, sending a flaming projectile right at him. Walker panicked, lost his footing, and fell to his death. With time running out, the turtles and April prepared to return to the present. But not everyone was ready to leave. Mikey, who had developed feelings for Mitsu, wanted to stay behind. Raphael also hesitated. He had found a place where he didn't have to hide and could live in peace. Even Leo was tempted to stay. But before they could decide, Kenshin lost patience in the present and activated the scepter. Mikey told Mitsu he would stay with her, but she asked him to return home instead. Kenshin had to return so that their 2 families could unite and end the war. With no time left, The turtles said their goodbyes to Mitsu and Yoshi and were pulled back to the present, except for Mikey, who didn't make it in time. Meanwhile, in the present, one of Norinaga's honor guards, now obsessed with modern life, tried to escape with the scepter. But before he could, Mikey activated it from the past, finally reuniting with his brothers. Perhaps because of the rapid succession of time displacements, the scepter ended up completely damaged. Back in the past, Kenshin and Mitsu reunited, bringing an end to the war. But in the present, things didn't look so great for Mikey. Sensing his melancholy, Splinter did what he could to cheer him up, and then the turtles ended the movie dancing to the rhythm of Technotronic. I've already compared the previous movies with their scripts, so why not do the same with this one? I have two scripts to look at this time, a second draft from February 1992, and a final draft with two revisions from May to June 1992. I feel like there are some general clarifications to make. Many lines were improvised during post-production because of the discrepancy between the original lines and the animatronic face movements. However, I don't think it was always because of that. Another clarification is that the second draft, while similar to the final one, shouldn't be considered the actual story. I'm including it to show how certain plot points evolved or got dropped as the movie developed. Finally, just like with the previous movies, the comic adaptation and novelization were based on one of the later revisions of the final draft. The film was clearly already shot when those were written, since set photos were used as references. The second draft was titled The Sacred Scroll of Death. By the time the final draft was written, the movie was already set to not have a subtitle. A few of the names changed between drafts. Lord Norinaga was Lord Naginata, and he lived at Kumano Castle. I'm not sure when the castle changed names, as it was still Kumano in the latest script. Kenshin was originally Kenichi in the second draft, then changed to Genji in the final draft. The name must have been changed in a future revision because he's Kenshin in both the novel and the comic. These scripts are also where I found the full names of the villains, Dirk Walker and Whit Whitley. Although Walker's first name wasn't exactly a secret, Dirk was used in promotional material in 1993. Whit's last name was also mentioned in the novelization. Mitsu was originally named Mitsuko Amura in the second draft, but later shortened to Mitsu Amura in the final draft. Since Mitsuko and Mitsu are variations of the same name, this was probably done to make it easier for Western audiences to pronounce. Now here's where things get really interesting. Stewart made the story take place in the year 1603 in the second draft, and later changed it to 1593 to make it exactly 400 years before the release of the movie. In the final film, the date went back to 1603. In a recent interview on the Turtle Tracks podcast, Stewart said he chose 1593 for the 400-year symmetry and had no idea where 1603 came from, assuming it was a post-production change. After 30 years, it's not unusual to forget a detail like this. However, not only did he initially pick 1603 as the year, but there was a good reason for it. That year marked the beginning of the Edo period in Japan. It was when Tokugawa Ieyasu was appointed shogun, establishing a shogunate that lasted over 260 years. This era was known for stability and isolationist policies, which would have tied neatly into the movie's theme of bringing peace to Japan. In fact, Lord Norinaga, or his earlier name, Lord Naginata, sounds an awful lot like Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who introduced European firearms into samurai warfare. By now, you may be wondering, wasn't this the plot of James Clavell's Shogun novel/miniseries? I can't really tell you who inspired who, but the Tokugawa stand-in was named Toranaga, which sounds even more like Norinaga or Naginata than the real historical figure. My best bet is that the Shogun novel and miniseries led Stewart to research Japanese history. The book was hugely successful, inspiring a 1980 TV miniseries and a 2024 remake. Even the Turtles seemed to think so, when they arrived in the past, literally name-dropping Shogun. Both 1593 and 1603 reference the end of the Sengoku period, but Walker's role in the movie leans more towards the Shogun novel than real history. The movie made it a point that the Turtles had to return home for Japan to find peace, which is an original plot for the film, and very different from what actually happened. but it probably served the purpose of trying to bring more young girls into the franchise. Walker's dying at the end lined up well with the start of Japan's isolationist period, when foreign traders were no longer welcome. Was this intentional? Maybe. But hey, I'm not a historian, so, do your own research. Since the comic adaptation and novelization were based on the final draft, they kept 1593 as the official year. However, no one was more confused by the change than Playmates Toys. Some bios on the film-inspired figures mentioned 1603 and the 16th century. Although, you probably can't blame the change in the script for that one. That was a long detour, almost as long as the original intro in the second draft, which spent 6 full minutes in feudal Japan before the turtles even showed up. Speaking of the beginning of the movie, remember those random mannequins scattered around the den? Well, in the script, they were actually practice dummies for a training sequence. In fact, the turtles' first scene underwent many changes. I think the original scene was simply too difficult to film with the turtle suits. In both the second and final drafts, the turtles' introduction was a full-on training session, more detailed than the ZZ Top music video style montage we got in the final cut. In this original scene, we can find the germ of the movie's theme. It was explicitly written that the den was built directly under an active subway tunnel, despite having a cool glass ceiling. Every time a train passed overhead, the whole layer shook, causing things to fall and break. This was meant to subtly push the idea that the turtles never really felt at home in New York, which, in return, made feudal Japan feel more peaceful by comparison. A similar moment still made it into the movie when Kenshin and the honor guards were feeling trapped in the den, and a passing train rattled everything. Another thing which is clearer in the adaptations is that April was going on a vacation. She was passing by the den because she was dropping her keys, and she also brought some gifts for the turtles and Splinter as a thank you for taking care of her place. In the original script, she was simply bringing things that were in her fridge and would otherwise spoil in her absence. Another, let's call it, missing plot from the scripts is the idea that April was suspected of being a spy for a Dutch pirate named Vandergelt. This was meant to add some intrigue early on, as the daimyo's men initially believed Kenshin had been taken by the Dutch. One major difference between the final movie and every other version of the script and adaptations is Donatello's watch subplot. In the script, the turtles needed to track how much time had passed since they left New York so they know exactly when to return. But when they fell off their horses, Donnie lost his watch in the mud. And while this subplot was completely removed, I think part of it is still visible in the movie. I suspect the line delivery couldn't align with the script, and the whole dialogue had to be replaced. I think this is still in the movie because you can see Donnie searching for something in the mud. Watches were a recurring symbol throughout both scripts, right until the very end of the film. Even clock-adjacent objects, like bells. Ultimately, this plot element became unnecessary once they introduced April's fake Rolex. More on that later. Another cut moment from the script, but still in the novelization, happened right after the rescue, back in the present. While everyone was asleep, one of the honor guards tried to steal the scepter so he could return home on his own. But Splinter had already thought ahead and switched it with a decoy. The second draft included an extended version of Mikey's first encounter with Mitsu and her grandfather. This would have set up some aspects of the movie. For example, Mitsu would have explained that she spoke English because her father had decreed it since English was the language of the traders. And unfortunately, her father had been killed by the daimyo. This extra dialogue would have helped establish Mitsu's connection to Mikey and explained why she trusted the turtles so quickly. She already knew about Mikey's brothers because he had told her they were out there. A missing scene from the script was also included in the novelization. And since the book has an actual picture, I think this was a deleted scene. In this scene, Walker saves Niles from punishment after failing to keep April locked up. Walker's excuse to save Niles was that he needed all of his men to help them invade the village. By this point, it was clear that Wit was spying for Walker since Kenshin was no longer suspected of being taken by the Dutch. Walker kept Wit's betrayal a secret, telling Norinaga that his pilot had escaped with April and needed to be recaptured. I already mentioned how many lines had to be improvised in post-production, either because the dialogue didn't match the animatronics or because they wanted to punch things up. For example, The movie's random Addams Family line was originally Guns N' Roses. One line in the script that felt completely out of place was the schwing, a reference to Wayne's World, which was very popular at the time. Mikey and Mitsu weren't the only romance in the movie. As you might have guessed, April and Whit were also attracted to each other. This was kind of there in the movie, but the script played it up more. The two kissed right after everything seemed lost, after the destruction of the second scepter. After the scene where the samurai discovered hockey, there was another short scene where a skeptic Walker refused to believe Niall's stories about the turtles being demons. One extended scene actually revealed why Leonardo wanted to stay. After the blacksmith started working on a replacement scepter, Leo recognized him. It was the legendary swordsmith, Goro Nyodo Masamune. Since the movie had already established that Leo was a sword geek, this would have been the ultimate reason for him to stay, learning directly from one of the greatest sword masters in history. Raphael's motivations were much clearer in the earlier drafts, especially in the final version. Through his dialogue, it's obvious that he saw Yoshi taking the same path he once did and wanted to protect him from it. At the same time, Raphael reconnected with his inner child through Yoshi, learning how to play again. For once, Raph was truly happy. So when he didn't want to go back, it actually made sense. Maybe Raph had always been so angry because he was forced to grow up too fast, spending every day training for a fight that might never come in a city that doesn't even know they exist, versus living in a town that respected them. After Mikey and Mitsu talked about Kenshin, there was another scene that still made it into the comic and novel. Mikey saw farmers using a precursor to nunchaku and decided to make himself a new pair, replacing the ones he lost when he arrived. Trying to impress Mitsu, he offered to make weapons for her too. But Mitsu, knowing they were going up against guns, didn't see the point. Whit's intentions weren't black and white. Several times he asked April to leave with him to go to New York, basically escaping from his reality. He learned about New York through April, who told him the story of her fake Rolex. Remember that. I'll come back to it later. When the turtles returned to the castle after rescuing Mitsu, they walked through a corridor. In the script, Mikey stopped and stared at an early painting of Miyamoto Usagi and had to be yanked away by Raph. This prop ended up at Mirage Studios for a few years, until Peter Laird gave it to Stan Sakai, Usagi Yojimbo's creator. Another interesting change from the script that was clearly censored was when Mikey intercepted the daimyo's attack on Mitsu. Norinaga's blade would have cut Mikey, and his blood would have given the daimyo the final clue that these were not demons. It would have given him the courage to face Leonardo in the end. Since the producers didn't want to show blood, this was probably removed in one of the later revisions. Similarly, Walker's death was also changed between drafts. In the second draft, he was supposed to go down in flames. While he would have died anyway, there was something ironic in him dying from a catapult attack. I guess we can now say that all the Ninja Turtles villains in this trilogy were defeated by gravity. During the climactic fight at the end of the movie, April would have lost her Rolex. If you remember, Donnie had lost his pocket watch on his arrival to feudal Japan. His worries were put aside when he discovered that April had her wristwatch. But now that they could no longer know the time, they needed to stay close to the scepter. The amount of drama Stu added to this climax was impressive. Aside from the watch drama, Leo wanted to bring back two extinct birds that Walker had as pets to unextinct them. Mikey and Raph didn't want to leave. Mikey had grown close to Mitsu, and Raph had finally found a place where he could live freely. No more hiding in the shadows. Leo also hesitated. The opportunity to learn from one of history's greatest swordsmiths was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. He could study under the great masters and take his skills to a whole new level. Mikey even considered fooling the scepter by putting statues instead of themselves. This way, they could bring everyone back to feudal Japan. But of course, this would have meant that the turtles would never be together again. In the end, none of it mattered, because the scepter had been activated earlier. Another scene would have taken place in the streets of New York, with Casey and the guards rushing back to the den. This scene is present in both scripts and the novelization. Another interesting detail in the second draft was that the subway den was located under 42nd and Madison. This is the location of Grand Central Station. Since there is a network of hidden tunnels and abandoned subway platforms there, it would have made total sense. Interestingly, around that time, those hidden tunnels were being used by the homeless, back then nicknamed the Mole People. A small difference between the drafts was that Kenshin would be the last to return to the past. Going back to the subway den, you may remember the running gag of everything shaking every time another train passed above them. Upon their return, the turtles simply gave up on trying to save everything. In the very final moment of that scene, a large chunk of plaster would have fallen towards Master Splinter, but the rat would have stopped it in the air with the power of his mind. Since the unstable nature of the den was there to contrast with the natural beauty of feudal Japan, you could say that it was all a state of mind, and that you could technically learn to live with it. The final draft completely changed the ending, and it's unclear at what point they decided on the 1-2 punch of Master Splinter making Mikey laugh, followed by the Technotronic dance number. The ending in the final draft matched the one in the comic and novel adaptations, with one key difference. The comic actually showed Mitsu and Kenshin reuniting in front of Lord Norinaga. Strangely, the script never finished that plotline. My guess is that by the time the comic was produced, a revision included that scene, or the movie was already filmed. And going back to the clock motif, this movie had an after-credits scene. It was present in both scripts, with one difference. In one version, it took place at dawn, in the other, it was at night. In it, Whit would have found April's fake Rolex, contemplated it for a while, and then tossed it away. Had this scene been kept with the sunset, it would have been a good callback for a movie that started with a sunset. TMNT III hit theaters on March 19, 1993, opening at number 1 at the US box office with a $12.4 million opening weekend. It went on to gross $42.2 million in the US and an estimated $54.4 million worldwide. At the time, CinemaScore, a system that measures audience reactions, gave the movie a B rating. That usually means audiences thought it was okay, but not satisfying. With a $21 million budget, the film landed between the first two movies in terms of cost. While the smaller budget may have affected quality, financially, it was a safer bet. Generally, movies need to make twice their budget to break even due to marketing and distribution costs. Since I don't have access to the full international numbers, it's hard to say for sure, but the movie likely made a small profit in theaters. However, TMNT III really found its audience in the home video market. It did well on VHS sales and rentals, which probably accounted for most of its profits. Plus, with the Turtles now having a full trilogy, the movie could be bundled with the first two films. And this is where one of the biggest misconceptions about the movie began. Around late 1993, international VHS releases and promotional materials, especially in Europe and Australia, started using the title Turtles in Time. No one really knows why, but the theory is that they wanted to tie it to the popular arcade game of the same name. Since then, many fans have referred to the film as Turtles in Time, even though that was never its actual title. Coinciding with the film's release, Playmates Toys put out a new wave of action figures. This included the 4 Samurai Turtles, Splinter, April, Kenshin, Warlord, Princess Mitsu, Walker, Rebel and Samurai soldiers, and a Turtle Pult that came with a Wit figure. Raph and Leo were also released as giant figures. There was even a massive castle playset in development, but it never made it past the design stage. 30 years after the movie's release, NECA put out a special set of action figures. It's unclear if they plan to continue releasing figures from this film, but with the Turtles, anything's possible. So why am I making this video now? Because TMNT Day, celebrated every March 19th, started because of this movie. It all began before the film's official release, on March 6, 1993, when New Line Cinema held a charity screening to support underprivileged children. As part of the event, Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley officially declared March 19th as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Day. During the ceremony, he praised the Turtles for promoting justice, integrity, honesty, self-esteem, respect, and good citizenship, all things they apparently stood for. There was also some sort of deal between the city and New Line. The studio promised to continue hosting screenings for kids in need and to keep hiring local actors and crews for future productions. Of course, the title confusion surrounding this movie didn't stop with home video releases. Even Mayor Bradley mistakenly thought the movie was called The Turtles Are Back in time. For the Turtles creators, this movie was the best they could hope for, given the budget and tight production schedule. Writer Paul Jenkins once recalled that after he and Kevin Eastman walked out of the theater, Kevin simply said, "At least it wasn't the second one." This was obviously the end of the road for the Turtles in theaters, for a while anyway. A fourth movie was planned for 1996, but never made it out of development hell. I'll be covering that unproduced sequel in a future video. And now, here are some fun facts about what happened to the cast after this movie. Sab Shimono, who played Lord Norinaga, later returned to the franchise in the 2012 cartoon as Mr. Murakami. Oddly, his casting was purely accidental. No one on the show even realized he had been in this movie. Here's another fun fact I picked up from the Turtle Tracks podcast. Paige Turco and Kevin Eastman dated and were even engaged for a while after this movie. But while the Turtles still had plenty of fans, their time in the spotlight was clearly fading. In just a few years, the cartoon would finish its run, 2 volumes of the Mirage comics would end, and the Turtles would move to another publisher. And eventually, one of the most polarizing projects would be born, the Next Mutation live-action show. By the late 90s, it seemed like the Turtles had sold their souls to producers and toy makers and were left out in the cold, with their creators not even talking to each other. It was, without a doubt, one of the harshest winters the franchise ever had to endure. Personally, I didn't even know this movie existed until I was an adult, so I have zero nostalgia for it. However, reading the scripts changed my perspective. I think it could have been a cult classic with a more artistic cinematic approach. After hearing interviews with the people involved on the Turtle Tracks podcast, I got the impression that no one was taking feedback seriously. They trusted too much in the Turtles' popularity and missed the mark on what made the first movie work. Once again, they misunderstood the appeal. Putting the suits in direct sunlight only made them look more artificial. And while the new animatronics may have been more technically efficient, they lacked the subtlety of the Henson Performance System. Even beyond the designs and the good enough animatronics, some choices stood out for me, like Casey Jones never sharing screen time with the Turtles. Of course, the movie had positives. The fact that they managed to replicate the performance system at all was impressive, even if it needed more polish. It could have been much better with the proper lighting and color grading. The Turtles used their weapons again, aside from the occasional nunchaku censorship in Europe. At least we got to see actual martial arts again, instead of American football. As I said, the script painted a better picture than the final film. There was a real story and even an attempt at character growth. Some things could have been clearer though. For example, I figured out that if the Turtles hadn't completed their mission, Japanese history, and by extension their own origin, would have been affected. But the movie never acknowledged this. There's also the strange coincidence with the 4 Kappa and the scroll. Watching the movie, you'd expect some kind of revelation, but nope. There were just 4 Kappa that happened to look like the Turtles. And then there's the time-traveling rules. They're clearly supernatural, so how did Donnie manage to science his way through all of it? That being said, the movie made a real effort regarding cultural representation. The production design team, led by Roy Ford Smith, put an outstanding level of detail into the Japanese setting. And it wasn't just set dressing. The cast included Asian actors and extras, making the world feel more authentic. Even the characters showed a balanced mix of good and evil on both sides, whether Japanese or foreign. If you haven't figured it out by now, the theme of this movie seemed to be about returning home, not just as a place, but in terms of identity and purpose. Every major character struggled with what home meant. The Turtles were living in an unstable, abandoned subway station, hiding from the world and training for a war that might never come. They had good reasons not to go back, especially when they were seen as heroes in the past and didn't have to hide in the sewers. Mikey's experience of being far from home made him connect with someone who also made him feel at home. He must have realized the difficulty of finding the same connection in the present. Raph discovered happiness by reconnecting with his inner child, and he was blown away by the clean, open landscapes of the past a considerable contrast from the sewers they called home. For Leo, living in the time of the samurai was basically a dream come true. But staying in the past meant breaking up the family, and Donnie, always the tech guy, had his own reasons to go back. Ultimately, the Turtles realized that home wasn't a place, it was staying together. The theme of home extended beyond the Turtles. Kenshin was torn between his father's mission and his own convictions. He didn't find a home in the castle, but in the rebellion. Wit was tempted to find a new home after falling for April. The Turtles even saved a village from invaders, another manifestation of the home theme. And then there was Walker, a man with no home, drifting through life exploiting others instead of finding his place in the world. By 1993, the franchise was losing steam, and the Turtles had been stretched thin under corporate control. A few years later, with Mirage no longer publishing comics and a canceled live-action show, the Turtles, just like in this movie, needed a home to return to. Back to their roots, under the care of their creators. Something that would eventually take place in the early 2000s. I'll be covering the unproduced fourth movie later this year, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. What are your thoughts on this movie? Does it have a home in your heart? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and happy TMNT Day!